I would just say that we are going to go in the order of the program and hear from Sonya and then Craig and then Jess. I thought it worked well downstairs if you would spend a couple minutes at the beginning just introducing yourself before launching into the paper that you brought. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a handout if anybody just walked in a little late. I'll maybe leave it on the chair there so when people come in, if people come in. So I'm Sonya. I am from Stony Brook, and I just recently completed my doctorate in music history and theory, so I'm not sure if I'm the only music person here, but I'm really excited to be here as kind of a sponge. I'm extremely thankful that Lisa is our moderator, because I think we have a lot of shared questions in music, and it kind of baffled me being here how most of them, many of them were the same, but it feels odd that there are so few music people represented, and so I'm really excited to just kind of soak in what perspectives you guys have for this work that I have here that I think does really widely resonate with what other people are working on or have connections to. I mean, just the previous talk, and I'm thinking about sampling, and I'm like, and how music, text, or sound, or not even just the notation, but the sounds have traveled in very, very various centuries and in various forms, and I maybe should have raised my hand, but okay, move on. So I have a little diagram and handout on the front. It's just an abstract, but just because I'm talking about a specific repertory of music that, in case you're not super familiar with, because it's kind of a stream of electronic music, and it's kind of in between the art and popular. I hate to kind of reduce it that way, and my whole dissertation is about complicating that, and so it was painful to lump everything in these contained spheres, but it's kind of just to orient you. And on the back are just some listener and reviewer responses, because we're going to do a little bit of the, I'm going to play a few of the tracks for you, and so you can kind of follow along in terms of what the aesthetic context was and became for some of the albums, because I'm talking about how they shift over time and how that shapes the kind of evolution of the genre. Let me wake up my computer. So there we go. My paper is called Technology Beyond the Objects in Experimental Electronica, Analog Warmth and Digital by Association, ? So this was, this is just a small little portion from a much bigger thing, and so here I'm trying to, I guess, the narrative thread, so taking a different narrative thread in that bigger project, so hopefully this will work. Okay. Contrasting with the more common approach in electronic music studies of viewing the technological objects per se, I look at how their aesthetic qualities have been regarded and valued. This paper focuses on how the analog and digital not only signify corresponding technologies, but rather how they have become aestheticized. Evolving ideas surrounding analog and digital technologies were and continue to be central to how electronic music was conceived and subsequently developed. Experimental electronica, one significant meta-genre of electronic music, represents an intriguing case in this regard, whereby ideas about the nature of analog and digital sound are not fixed, but are fluid with multivalent and sometimes perplexing ramifications. I will briefly examine 3 albums that demonstrate how the analog and digital are imagined and reimagined. These albums and the concepts attached to analog and digital, i.e., these albums and the discourses surrounding them will show an instability and flux of the concepts attached to analog and digital, i.e., the warm and the cold, and will ultimately show how unstable the analog and digital are in and of themselves in aesthetic terms. The words analog and digital work as constructs forged by the various assumptions and notions about them, rather than solely connoting literal objects. I begin with the 1998 release of Boards of Canada's first official full-length album, Music Has the Right to Children. This debut grabbed attention for its strong aesthetic statement, helping to define what became before, what was current, and what was to come in experimental electronica and beyond. As early as their first published interview, critics noticed the new sound Boards of Canada were offering. Quote, Boards of Canada see warp as one of the few labels bold enough to head away from the overtly techno sound. Ironically, the striking bold sound was old sounds, analog sounding sounds. The very fact that Boards of Canada's sound was unexpected or surprising drew attention to a pervasiveness of this techno, or what I would also call here, digital sound and experimental electronica, and furthermore, a majority of other contemporaneous electronic music genres at this time. So to give a kind of bigger context, just a sweeping generalization that in the mid-90s, Many of the genres were either assumed a digital sound or were moving towards a more synthetic or what was assumed as digital sound. Speaking to this sound, a strict, hyper-precise, abstracted, and timbre-emphasized sound was prized, exaggerated, and became the dominant in experimental electronica, as well as these other electronic music genres in varying degrees at this time. This sound was often facilitated by and prompted the development of new digital technologies that increased the precision in music makers' sound editing, whereby a new level of exactitude, manipulation, precision, programmability, and refinement was possible. However, I emphasize here, more than simply achieving this kind of sound, digital technologies became aestheticized with this corresponding sound signifying them. Thus, this kind of meticulous sound was heard, worked with, and equated as digital, as an aesthetic construct and concept, and became the status quo and the context for much experimental electronica. Though using mostly digital tools in creation, production, and dissemination, the Boards of Canada album offered an alternative to this deliberately electronic and more specifically what was equated as a digital sound that had seemingly become ubiquitous. Their sound reminded listeners of old public television specials and elementary school film reels. The band's name was even an homage to the National Film Board of Canada, whose grainy educational vignettes from the 70s and 80s stirred up nostalgic feelings in those who remembered them. And these associations made their way into the band's sound. It was fuzzy, lush, hazy, slightly messy around the edges, and reminded listeners of the past. It was also a bracing antidote to this precise, machine-like, clean and sterile sound of electronic music artists and other streams who were their contemporaries. By incorporating some vintage analog synth sounds, but more squarely manipulating other sounds in specific ways, notably and literally digitally, such as by imparting reverb or other additional layers of noise and whatnot, they affected the analog. And so we'll listen to a little bit of Roy G. Biv from this album. Listeners began knowingly and unknowingly to identify this sound as being associated with older analog technologies. Boards of Canada's sound was like tube amps, slide projectors, and Super 8 cameras, and their associated sepia tones, vinyl pops, and scratch negatives, all contributing to an almost universal perception of warmth and organicism by listeners. Though not necessarily new descriptors, especially of analog technologies, warm, organic, and other related ideas being mapped onto analog were specifically revealed in experimental electronica, as they enumerated some of its key aesthetic tenets and how these principles would accumulate and change meaning over time. That they were warm and organic pooled together certain formative aesthetic understandings of how analog sound was imagined, providing an aesthetic vocabulary and also counterpoint, in turn forcing an articulation and reconsideration of what had apparently become the dominant sound at this time, the digital. And thus the more digital sounding works and artists would be described and reinforced as cold and sterile. And though their work evidenced this contrast, these sounds were not necessarily in conflict. This new dialogue, whereby digital and analog were aestheticized, opened up areas for sonic exploration in experimental electronica, through which these mapped perceptions themselves, the cold, clinical, organic, human, and so forth, would also be played with aesthetically and thus commingle and overlap, often regardless of the technologies actually being employed. Whereas previously in experimental electronica existed within a mainly digital context, this reacquaintance with the analog by the Boards of Canada helped to open up an aesthetic dialogue about electronic sound, one that expanded into discussions of electronic, non-electronic, and even acoustic sounds. Music that invited such descriptors as warm and cold provided an impact to the discursive framework for subsequent experimental electronica releases and would raise somewhat retrograding questions concerning technology, like what is acoustic, live, what about sampled sounds, what are instruments? By the time Fenech released his third full-length solo album, Endless Summer in 2001, warm and organic could not be inextricably linked or permanently ascribed to analog sounds and equipment. Here, the cold, the warm, and the so forth came to mean something different as they directly related to approach, imaginations, and suppositions of the technologies that play in the music. So I'm going to skip over this, the kind of details about finish in kind of thinking about time here, and just play for you the title track, Endless Summer. And you can maybe follow along the quotes, but also think for yourself how maybe we can listen for how the analog and digital, electronic and acoustic have been sonically constructed and played with, and how the aesthetics ideas of warmth and coldness, or the human or the inhuman, might be mapped onto some of these sounds. Moving on. Onkyo artists, Astro, Twin, and Cosmos represent yet another approach of this technological mix-up and play. The two groups feature Amy Yoshida as vocalist and Uta Kawasaki on analog synthesizers as the duo Astro Twin, and again Yoshida as vocalist with Sachiko M on sampler and contact microphones manipulated onto objects as the other duo Cosmos. Their split release was awarded the top prize, the Golden Nika, at the prestigious 2003 Pre-Ars Electronica Festival. Although the prize for digital music, several Onkyo artists do not necessarily utilize digital technologies in a way that highlights the digital qualities of the medium, and some do not use digital technologies at all. Like Boards of Canada and Finnish, many Onkyo artists also overlap analog and digital technologies in an even more deliberate and eclectic manner. These sounds are also not necessarily processed through laptops, as would be typical in other experimental electronica genres, nor are the digital instruments necessarily treated digitally, and that they are often manipulated by hand like mechanical objects, as in Sachiko M's case. Though recorded digitally, there's something only minimally digital about the specific instruments and the creative manifestation of the recording. The crackling sounds might or might not be digital glitches or effects run through digital processing, but might rather be Yoshida screeching in inimitable ways into the microphones, or the sounds produced by some sort of crunching or scratching of material up close or too close to the microphones. Thus, although Onkyo certainly falls under the umbrella of experimental electronica, their classification in this genre unmasks certain assumptions about the repertory and many of its genres. The centrality of the computer and software may be generally thought as emblematic and definitive of experimental electronica, yet this music is not confined to the use of such technologies. As these technologies became central to several other experimental electronica genres, an assumption arose that these technologies were ubiquitous across subgenres and supposedly among like-minded artists. For example, the New York Times' Anthony Tomasini misleads readers in his review of the 2005 Onkyo Marathon in New York City with an article created on the computer, but pristine it is not. During performances by the festival's main headliners, Otomo Yoshihide and Sachiko M, neither made use of computers. Likewise, returning to the Golden Nika awarded recordings, there are no wholly digital instruments employed in Astro Twin nor in Cosmos. While the sampler in Cosmos is technically digital, it is not quite treated so musically. I meant to have a sound example from Astro Twin, since that is vocalist and analog, since because that kind of evidences this kind of misleading ideas about the technologies. But my CD got punched in my suitcase, and it's one of those discs that it doesn't exist on iTunes, and you can't buy it online. But I found someone illegally streaming the Cosmos disc, and so I'll play some of that for you. Which, again, we'll get they're related albums, and they're coming from the same aesthetic standpoint. Underscoring the importance of how technologies are conceptualized in experimental electronica, what then made these works digital, and how is that important? Presumably, being digital is a primary defining quality, as the category was in fact previously and very controversially renamed digital musics in 1999. Was this album eligible because it was recorded onto DAT tape and presumably digitally mastered? These are hardly foundational qualities, especially to distinguish something as categorically digital music. The jury members for the 2003 Goldenica were alert to these questions and addressed this paradox in their final statement. Attempting to provide some sort of resolution, they offered the following suggestion, to which I would concur, though not limit to the digital. That is, what unites these artists here is a sensitivity to what digital technologies have offered and revealed to users and listeners, not necessarily the technologies themselves. The jury asserted the possibility of a digital sensibility or attitude based upon audio, quote, audio work produced from this philosophical position, end quote. Referring to the 2003 winners, the statement goes on to pose how, quote, above all, this kind of music questions the relevance of defining or celebrating any kind of audio activity in relation to a single technological approach, end quote. Earlier I mentioned how a certain digital sound had gained prominence in various electronic musics and was the norm in most experimental electronica, a sound that featured sparse, precise, timbre-emphasized musical materials. Though digital technologies had the capacity to manipulate sound on an immensely precise level, this did not necessarily determine a resultant sound. However, a sound did become affiliated with digital technologies, as was indicated, a kind of minimalist, glitchy, hyper-precise, cold, sterile sound that seemed to emphasize and divulge the technologies. In experimental electronica, this pervasive and defining sound importantly helped to unite and define a range of artists from across the genres under this aesthetic umbrella. This umbrella would represent varying practices and technologies, including those who did not necessarily or solely work with digital technologies like Astro Twin and Cosmos, as the sound aesthetic, though seemingly digital, needn't necessarily be digitally derived. Though perhaps Astro Twin and Cosmos might not be technically digital, their approach to sound both equated them to a digital sound and connected them to other digital artists, demonstrating a sensibility, aesthetic, and affiliation that, in some cases, misled them as digital, as the above New York Times example reveals, and made them curiously digital by association. These three examples deal with the digital and analog in very different and unorthodox ways, manifesting flexible artistic and aesthetic positions, and help to evidence how experimental electronica was not solely hinged upon issues concerning the changing technologies themselves, but the changing ideas and assumptions and associations about them.
Okay, I'm going to get started with a very different kind of analog or a different kind of natural sound by talking about nature sounds. My name is Craig Eley. I'm currently the postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for the Arts and Humanities at Penn State. And I'm also really excited to be on this roundtable with Sonya and Jess and Lisa and to hear where the conversations take us. So like I said, I'll talk about my own research in the history of recording environmental sounds, and then muse for a little bit on how early field recording techniques influenced digital sound practices, as well as think for a little bit on how natural history media might be able to provide new insights into sound and media studies. So I'm guessing some, but maybe not all of you are familiar with what we're looking at here, which is a sound spectrogram, a visualization of a sound recording that shows the occurrence of amplitude and frequency over time, with frequency on the y-axis, time on the x-axis, and amplitude represented by changes in color. In this case, louder frequencies are more orange, although these spectrograms can be made with lots of different color palettes. This particular spectrogram shows the staccato high-frequency sounds of the rarest bird in North America, the ivory-billed woodpecker. As an aside, in the Museum of Fine Art right now, there's an Audubon exhibit where you can go look at one of his paintings of the ivory-billed woodpecker. For those of you interested in birding and bird lore, I could talk about the ivory-billed woodpecker all day. It's listed. A friend of mine went to see the exhibit yesterday and noted that it's listed on the plaque as probably extinct. So the myth of the ivory bill lives on. Anyway, this particular ivory bill, whose voice is represented here, was recorded on April 9th, 1935 from the back of a mule cart in a Louisiana swamp. The recordist was Peter Paul Kellogg, an ornithologist turned sound engineer from Cornell University. I really wish I would have turned my retweets off as I'm reading from my phone. The recordist was Peter Paul Kellogg, an ornithologist turned sound engineer from Cornell University. He and his colleagues, Albert R. Brand and Arthur Allen. Arthur A. Allen his nickname was Doc. He was the head of the ornithology lab at this time at Cornell. He took these photographs, and then what you're seeing here is a hand-painted glass slide that he would have made for performances or for lectures. So anyway, these group at Cornell were pioneers in mobile outdoor recording. In 1929 and 1930, Albert Brand, a retired stockbroker who became affiliated with Cornell, spearheaded used motion picture film to photograph the sounds of birds. Using the Fox Movietone system, they wired microphones to a light source that would flicker as the birds sang. This all took place in the back of a big truck, burning the sounds onto film. The distance between the lines measured frequency, and the length of the lines measured time. They would then examine the film strips under low-powered microscopes in order to count the notes, measure their frequencies, and chart them for comparisons to other sounds and technologies. This image, which I know is kind of poorly reproduced here, shows bird songs mapped onto piano keys and compared to the audible range of a variety of instruments, human voices, and at the very bottom there, onto the frequency capacities of wire transmission circuits. A thing here which I'll return to later is you can see that bird notes well exceed the end of the piano keys. These are a variety of instruments here. So we have the bass, the cello, the French horn, flute, etc., piccolo. And then here, this widest band is a television circuit. And then this shorter one here at the bottom is what they call an ordinary telephone talking circuit. So you can see how these bird sounds were already kind of immediately integrated into pre-existing sound technologies and other media technologies as well.
Which are the bird sounds?
The bird sounds are like listed, in this case they're listed out here. They're actually like faintly penciled in these areas, which you can't see in this reproduction, unfortunately. Once they had the sounds onto film, they could easily transfer those film strips back into sound waves and copy them onto 78 RPM phonograph discs. This is the center label for American Bird Songs, a 6-disc set released by Brandon Cornell in 1942 after the initial successes of Songs of Wild Birds in 1934 and More Songs of Wild Birds in 1936. Those are actually very nice editions that are hard to find, the 34 and 36 editions of Songs of Wild Birds that come with a nice book. American Bird Songs, you can find a copy today for like $20 on eBay. They're pretty widely produced 78s. You need a record player that could play 78s, but it's a pretty good record. The ability to record bird songs onto film radically reconfigured natural history knowledge and the way that knowledge was presented to the public. Starting in the 1930s, the American Museum of Natural History, in collaboration with Cornell, began added recording sound to their taxidermic habitat groups. Writing about these initiatives in 1936, Cornell grad student James T. Tanner, who, as another aside, later in life became obsessed with the ivory-bill woodpecker. He's one of the last people to ever see it alive in person. But he observed, if a representation of nature is to be constructed, it is no longer complete without the sounds of nature. So where for a while the taxidermic display group, or the habitat group as it was known, was considered in some ways kind of the pinnacle of natural history display, was now seen as inadequate because it was mute. These sounds also challenged some foundational assumptions about the relationship between sound nature and human hearing. In a journal article from 1935, which is where this image comes from, as well as the piano key image in the ornithological organ, the auk, Albert Brand discusses the vast differences between analyzing bird sounds with film and analyzing them by ear, by taking comparable samples of analyses done in the ornithological literature and then comparing them to his own findings. In one example, a respected observer had documented the song of a wren lasting 7 minutes and 20 seconds and containing what he heard as 5 distinct notes. Brand had a recording that was about 3 seconds shorter than that, in which, under the microscopic examination, he counted 113 different notes. It was some of the first conclusive evidence that I've come across to explicitly identify that birds made sounds that far exceeded the limits of human hearing, what had previously been understood as sound. So the visualization of natural sounds served to expand the very definition of sound itself. And it also pointed not only to frequencies that we couldn't hear, but the rapidness, the rapidity that we also couldn't pick up. So very, very fast bird notes. And even before magnetic tape technology, which made this process much easier, they would map the sound film, they would play the sound film at much, much slower speeds in order to hear it. So back to the spectrograph and its close cousin here, the waveform, which we're probably more familiar with. Here they are side by side. The waveform is really much more imprecise. It's really just amplitude over time. 0 is in the middle because the top and bottom represent the left and right channel in a stereo recording usually. But at the bottom, as you can see with the spectrogram, we have frequency and time as well as amplitude represented by the colors. But the evolution of these visualization techniques, so moving from the sound film photograph onto the spectrogram and the waveform, are still used today at Cornell in both their laboratory research and in the way that they present their sounds online. This is a screen capture from the Macaulay Library at Cornell, which has recently made most of their sound holdings available for live streaming. Though the view on the website defaults to a simple MP3 player that we would recognize with the little arrow and the line, you can also click through to this player, which they developed, which allows you to follow along with a waveform and spectrogram while you listen. So, in case you are dying to hear the sound of an ivory-billed woodpecker, this is that, in fact, recording from 1935. Its distinctive call is known as its kint, and hopefully we can hear this. Yeah, no dice on the volume here, huh?
Volume up and then black pen.
So that's the ivory bill's kint. That's obviously not the pecking noise. That's like a mating call or a distress call. Okay, so natural history media, both in scientific practice, in these commercially released records, and in less formal channels such as amateur naturalism, have historically and often unintentionally established a variety of representational practices for the sounds of nature that took hold in many other genres and formats. In his recent book on the history of the MP3, Jonathan Stern has suggested that digital history should be reevaluated through the history of sound and communications media, since he argues many of the things that we recognize about new media and visual practices happened first in sound technologies. He presents the ideas of format theory and compression history as new entry points for media history, but I might suggest adding natural history to this framework, a field whose visuality has been almost exhaustively cataloged and theorized, but whose soundtracks have gone historically unheard. If we understand that new media technologies, such as the ability to capture and visualize birdsongs on film, not only refer to and represent the media preceding them and concurrent with them, I mean, all of this stuff would not have been possible without synchronized sound film technologies that were developed in the entertainment industry. They're using the Fox movie tone system. By some anecdotal accounts, the reason they start doing this kind of work is because people in the Hollywood film industry come to them and say, we're having a hard time recording birds. Do you guys know what to do? So that's a part of this. But we also understand that these representations establish the framework and boundaries of representation itself. So I think we have to consider the history of environmental media practices, natural history media, when we consider the larger and more pressing issues of sound and environment more broadly. Focusing on natural history media might also allow us to break free, if just slightly, from the notion that all sound media are exclusively communications media. As John Durham Peters has pointed out, though the idea of communication has structured some of our fantasies about interspecies dialogue, often in weird and problematic ways, animals and the natural world are more accurately things that we commune with, not that we necessarily communicate with. By extending media history into natural history and vice versa, it is not my intention to radically decenter the role that humans and human technologies have played in shaping the natural world, but in fact the opposite. to demonstrate how the natural world as we understand and value or not value it has been profoundly shaped by sound and sound technologies, in ways both positive and negative. It is not a coincidence that we use almost exclusively sonic metaphors, such as being in harmony, to describe our experiences in the natural world. By reformulating a natural history, digital history, and sonic history that accounts for non-communicative, or I guess not explicitly communicative, experiences and technologies, we might continue and even advance the long tradition of humanities work that rethinks the human place in nature. Thanks.
Extinction, speculation, question mark, buff was really appeased with that talk. Very excited. My name is Jess. I'm a first-year graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm here to talk about something that I think Jason, our opening speaker, mentioned, which is something that I thought would be out there when I started working as a community radio DJ and eventually taught a high school class on the history of popular music. And I had all of these tools in my head that would be so great to bring into the classroom or to use to look at blues and country music and regional rockabillys and a lot of these popular musics from the 20s and 30s and 40s, and I just couldn't find them anywhere. So part of this talk is a little bit of the story of how I came to look for these things, and part of it is a kind of a space for me to air my dream for some digital humanities tools that I think would be really useful for teaching popular music history in the classroom. So I'm hoping to hear all of your ideas and challenges on that front, and I will try to keep this very short so that we can talk about all these exciting things. So yeah, this all came out of an experience I had a couple of years ago teaching or designing and teaching a history of popular music at a very non-traditional Quaker high school that was devoted to sustainability and social justice. So I had a lot of freedom and didn't have to stick to the Common Core, but it was really exciting, and I wanted to design a class that would bring together the huge range and diversity of popular musics, many of which were really regionally inflected in the 20s and 30s. And right away, I just ran into a question of how to get these musics. I couldn't find a central library that I could go to and check out a bunch of, digitized files or copies of old 78 records. And I got really lucky and used a combination of re-releases that I had gotten through my tenure working in radio, and then happened upon some CDs that were for sale amongst a collective of 78 RPM collectors who had kind of cobbled all of these things together through a bunch of exchanges, and they were all, so they said, public domain files from before the copyright cutoff, and I was able to get a lot of these sound files in mass numbers in order to teach the class. But that's where I started thinking about how great it would be if there were some other kind of archive or resource for this. So the second thing I wanted to bring up is how to think about the historic listener in the classroom. I was, of course, really interested in bringing my students the music itself, but I also wanted us to get to think about how people in different moments and places in time might have listened to popular music specifically, but I really want to extend this to the wider world of sounds. So we did a number of different historic listening experiments and exercises in class. We started off just paying attention to different things at different moments, lyrics or timbre. We tried to listen for traces of different technologies that would have been used, like overdubs in Buddy Holly songs, or whether we were listening to cylinder recordings or 78 recordings that had been digitized. And of course it wasn't a very true perspective because I was playing everything off of my computer. I didn't have any way to play the cylinder in the classroom. But we also, at some point in time, just like threw up our hands and engaged in, I think, wildly speculative historic practices, like closing our eyes and imagining who would have been listening to particular records, where they could have been, were they dancing or not, were they with other people. But largely we also tried to build a world around these sounds. So we used everything from YouTube videos documenting the visual culture on the Ozark Jubilee television show for country music. We're looking at early advertisements for phonograph records. We looked at Billboard charts. We looked at discographies that many collectors had worked for years to compile. There's a really good one for old country and hillbilly records and one for gospel and blues that have both been released fairly recently. We tried to look at tour materials and evidence of circulations and where artists were moving, as well as thinking about what it would be like to have access to performance halls and venues and radio station records, actual spaces where sounds were being produced. And of course, the holy grail would be fan club materials and actual evidence of reception. So I came here today to just talk about a dream of mine, which has been so stoked by being at this gathering. It's great to be here, and the last panel before us was fantastic. So my question is, I would love to work in my lifetime to build some sort of a sound map that is going to do for popular music and listening history what projects like Ryan's might be doing for the world of print culture. So I wanted us to get a chance to talk about, first of all, what some differences might be doing this work with sound and with specifically recorded technologies that are circulating on record versus in sheet music or other formats. And I also wanted us to get to talk about some differences, opportunities, and challenges of doing this work with the 20th century with materials that may be in copyright. And I also want to just think about the different, I think in many ways, academic reception histories of music on records and print cultural materials, which is that a lot of this stuff, even if it is in the public domain, is sitting in some guy's basement in Mass in Frederick, Maryland. And lots of really amazing private re-release labels are eating that stuff up and getting the rights to digitize it and releasing it in really awesome or often expensive box sets. But I want us to think about ways that digital humanities technologies, even given the challenges of copyright and tracing provenance and finding this stuff, could be used to bring this music to a wider public outside of just academics or circles of collectors. I found that my high school students love this stuff. The students from my class all gone on to be very excited about different musical projects, and they were interested to begin with. But I think sound history is especially such a rich place to bring primary sources to secondary and even primary classrooms, and I think it's a great opportunity also to do local level and community partnerships, because so many of these sounds were regional. So that's my dream and experience, and so I'd love for us to just get to set all this in conversation with the great ideas that have been moving this symposium.
Okay, I'm going to jump up here. We have a good 45 minutes if we would like to take it to discuss some of these issues. And I think that just getting to that question of how sound fits or can fit into the project of digital humanities is a terrific one, and maybe one that we should bracket temporarily and engage a little bit in some more specific questions about the papers, and then maybe come back to some more freewheeling speculation about DH and sound. And share our knowledge there. But so I think that, I guess if I can try and draw a thread of connection between Sonya and Craig's paper, it would be in thinking about, on the one hand, the ways in which sound studies has taught us to think about the natural in relation to the technological in the acoustic sphere. And just to see that as a very sort of complex proposition in which the natural becomes a kind of back formation of the technical. And so this project of natural history media, I think, is grabbing on to a kind of core interest in sound studies that would help push it in further ways and get us further. And Sonya, I think there's a way in which you're doing something entirely complementary too, in asking us to think about how we locate the digital in the sonic, right? So you're using phrases like technically digital, right? We're wholly digital, or digital only by association, to think about the ways that people are experiencing this experimental sort of acoustic art that you're interested in a particular moment. And to me, those just seem intuitively like really complementary projects, showing some of the real depth and importance and excitement in sound studies. They can be hard to translate to audiences that don't work in sound. I guess some of the profit of Jess's question, which I want to again defer for a little bit, is that it would make us speak to people who are not centrally invested just in sound studies, but be able to talk across other mutual interests. So that's all I'll say, but could we open the floor to some questions for the panelists? Yes.
It was a wonderful panel. Thank you all. I have a question about your talk, Craig, about the recording, especially from the 30s. Mm-hmm. And it seems what's so interesting, so sort of following what you just said, Lisa, about the self-evidence of the natural is challenged at the very moment when these recordings are going into the home to make this new technology feel accessible and familiar. I can hear a bird song played. Oh, my record player is more familiar than it seemed before, more natural. So I'm wondering if you see that tension elsewhere in the time period and how this stuff is received. If you could talk more about the reception of these recordings.
Yeah, who buys birdsong records?
Yeah. Okay. This is a good question, and this is I can go backwards a little bit into the project here, because what I didn't get to talk about and what I'll tell you about right now is you've got 40 good years of recording history before you can record an animal. Okay, right? Because the phonograph is pretty much in popular use by 1890, and you can't record a bird until 1930. What happens in that ensuing 4 years?
It's like 20 years where you can't record women.
What happens in that time period, though, is an incredible wealth of animal imitations. Okay, so the bird sounds that were recorded by Cornell are actually very much in line in reference to an earlier tradition of animal imitation bird imitation that was done by whistling. And those whistling imitation records, a man, usually a man, although it was also a female practice, came on and would say, the whippoorwill, and then whistle it, okay? And then when Cornell released their first album of bird songs, it was structured in the exact same way. A narrator would come on and say, the whippoorwill, and then you would hear it. So, in fact, what's going on with these records isn't even really a radical break. What's going on is when they talk about them, they go, hey, you're familiar with those imitation records, now we can record actual birds, as opposed to the fake birds that people were listening to earlier. So that is part of it. It actually wouldn't have been like a radical break for listeners necessarily. It would have been like a cool new development for people who were already listening to birds. So that's one part of what you're asking, I think. Another part is who buys it? Hard to say. At Cornell, they have records of how many of these things that they sell. It's not a whole lot, but it's probably in the same subset of people who we understand as being amateur birders. A lot of them are sold to schools and libraries for educational purposes. A lot of them are very popular they're sold a lot to the National Talking Book Program. They're sold a lot to the blind, who seem to be like uniquely receptive to these ideas. Cornell gets a lot of letters from schools for the blind that are like, hey, we had these whistlers, but can we get some of your stuff? Cornell has a weekly radio program that's syndicated in the Northeast for a while called Know Your Birds. And so that would have been some of the places that they were.
I could add a little anecdote to that. You probably know, I don't know if you remember whose paper this was many years ago. There's a composer named Olivier Messiaen who was obsessed by bird songs, and there's this amazing paper that I saw of, it wasn't even that he was, he incorporated bird songs into his compositions, but he wasn't incorporating them as he heard. He was incorporating them as he heard them off of these records. And so the comparison of the paper drew was, with every release of the album, like the kind of scope of birds that were on this album were the ones that were in the piece that led people to, that was kind of direct connection that he was learning from or imitating, not the actual birds, even though that was the imagined bird, but it was the sound of the birds on the recording, which was amazing to think about that. It was just so literal, the transmission of that.
Well, there's just such a great echo of, again, this sort of present condition in DH. When you talk about the switch to kind of optical analysis of the bird songs and how much more it gets you. I mean, that's exactly the argument being made for modeling. You know, my computer can read 5,000 novels, I can't, right? And you know, we heard a little of that downstairs just in the last panel too. I mean, just so this is another little, you know, nothing new under the sun kind of moment to think about knowledge production.
But I wanted to go back to something that you were, you know, the kind of this juncture moment in terms of thinking about, you know, birds and birds, first of all, by calling them bird song, already puts them in this kind of limited, you know, when you put up that first chart of how the musical instruments were mapping up, and the idea of putting bird song and thinking about them in terms of pitch was this terribly limiting thing. And so, I mean, not terribly limiting, but you know, they're certainly used to that. But yeah, certainly the visualization is incredibly important, but not, you know, it's not doing everything. But at the same time, it kind of counterbalances this idea that you know, that our note-dominated system kind of has imposed on how we think about the bird songs. And you know, most of the bird song is lost by notating it. So then, you know.
Well, and also,
the timbre and the sounds and
yeah, and I mean, even before note mapping, or maybe alongside note mapping, I need to do more work on the history of transcription, but also how mapping bird notes onto language. You know, like how many bird notes are on, bird names are onomatopoetic, and the whippoorwill makes the sound whippoorwill, whippoorwill. You know, and like
in English at least.
Yeah, exactly. And so like and chickadee dee 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 dee, right, is the sound of the chickadee. And so how that, yeah, right, and how. Right, so you already had this, yeah, the ways that we map them that go back to earlier.
Sonya, can I ask you a kind of corresponding question? And it's partly a canon question, because I don't know the stuff that you work on at all. You know, so you told us about 3 albums. Why those 3 albums? You know, how many others could you have picked from? What's the, you know, so that's the canon question. But within that, I mean, obviously when you get to people, you know, doing digital music from laptops and then digital synthesizers and stuff, we're so, I mean, I'm just imagining, we're so far beyond notation, the notes, pitch, frequency. You know, there's so many other variables kind of built into digital systems. How do you begin to talk about that? I mean, what we saw you do in your paper is to go to kind of critical receptions, right, and to pick up this vocabulary of warm and cold and things like that. Are there alternatives?
Well, I mean, the reason I'm working with experimental electronica, and that's my focus, but kind of like the bigger kind of story with that is that, you know, this kind of dialogue about what is analog and digital and what the imaginations that go along with them. I mean, these discussions are embedded in the history of electronic music across genres, and in most genres, analog and digital are pitted against each other, which, you know, is very clear about the discussions that we've already been having about, you know, print media, the newspaper versus the digital newspaper, whatever. I mean, these are discussions that are, you know, have long been in music, and they've been transforming and changing, and there's been pros and cons on various sides. And so the reason, you know, what interested me about experimental electronica was that they weren't necessarily pitted against each other, that, you know, the analog, the ideas about analog and digital and what was, you know, seemingly positive or negative in one genre, those were the things that were being played with or pitted, you know, aesthetically, instead of, you know, the sphere about what of being cold and sterile was something that was, you know, kind of further exaggerated and contrasted against, instead of, you know, being derided in any way. I'm not sure if that.
Well, so it's again sort of the sociological properties of music as it's perceived, but there must be too a way to refer to, you know, that button on the right that does that thing. You know, the thing, you know, would be something that would be like a note or a pitch or a frequency. There must be all kinds of other things that have been introduced by the digital tools that might eventually give us a language to talk about, you know, the doohickeyness, you know.
Well, and that's the thing, that the majority of electronic music histories focus on the doohickeyness, and there are stories about the doohickeys, and there are narratives about this and this, you know, the development of electronic tape that necessarily moved to this, that necessarily moved to this, that necessarily moved to this, and experimental electronica, and that people, I mean, and it's not just limited to, you know, there's certainly there's turntablists who kind of throw the technologies on their heads, but because, you know, experimental electronica represents kind of extreme of kind of turning those things upside down and kind of playing with the narrative of time and evolution of advancing technologies, and also like what their presumed characteristics are or should be. Again, the Yoshida, I only extracted a few quotes, but the idea that one would mistake her voice very easily for a digital sound is, I mean, an amazing thing. It's an incredible thing that, we're, like, how people are mimicking machines, and what that means to mimic and become a machine in some way.
Augusta?
I'm kind of intrigued. I don't know anything about sound studies, so let me just start with that. All right. So there's a little bit of a free association, really, more with the sort of some of the ideas that are circulating in your papers, and particularly struck, obviously, with the ways in which these papers have these points along the line between nature and culture, between the past and the present, the future, all that, blah. Okay, framework. So, but what I'm interested in really is this kind of contrast between your paper and the Electronica, and the association with Electronica with hyper-sophistication and all that sort of stuff. And your material, leaving the birds out for a moment, because I love birds, otherwise I'll only talk about birds. So, and your material, which presents, at least, again, from a person who knows nothing really in a scholarly way about that, with this sort of innocence and naturalness and, this kind of thing, this sort of lack of sophistication. And yet, like, thinking about listening to that music, which is hyper sophisticated, incredibly, these musical instruments are transformed, in these various different applications, in these various different kinds of song traditions. So I guess the contrast to me would be, I would love to hear you guys just kind of talk through that a little bit, because to me it's really a fascinating, they're like each other and then not in these sort of interesting ways. So it's a vague and conceptual question.
Mm-hmm.
If you'd like to take it up.
Go ahead. I was just going to babble. Go ahead.
Oh, no.
That's a terrific point, I think, and it does bring these papers together. And I think it also shows up something interesting in sound studies, that, even as the rest of us, beyond sound studies, have gotten kind of frustrated with the limitations of the triad medium, format, genre.
Yeah.
Like, there's all kinds of other stuff we need to know. Sound studies, sort of importantly, has always had authenticity, as a register there. And so that each of the papers could be seen as wrestling
With
there
that
with
concept.
medium
Yeah.
and authenticity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you
Just
for giving that.
Did you?
Oh, I was just going to say, I've been really influenced by two younger scholars working, Carl Hextrom Miller and Pat Huber, both of whom are, I think, making specific interventions about like rural vernacular music, and arguing about this notion of authenticity, and saying that in the one case, the marketing of what were called blues or race and old-time or hillbilly markets was very much, a product of Jim Crow level segregation and industry efforts to create markets, and the performers in fact were moving between those catalogs, and the discographies that are coming out are showing that. And Pat Huber similarly is looking at how country music in the North Carolina Piedmont is coming out of textile factories in a way that's very connected to labor and to industrial practices. And so I think it all depends on the point of reception. I think some of the innocence that we impart to folk music comes from the 50s, or the way that Lomax and different ethnographers were building collecting practices and looking for isolated, I'm forgetting the word they always use, these throwback instances where old true folk songs and ways are being preserved. But I think at earlier moments in the 20s, these performers were very conscious of fads for grandfather music or old-time songs then, which were, recalling the 1870s or things like that. So I think, in some ways, looking at this moment in the 20s and 30s, I think they weren't debates about warmth and coldness or the digital, but they were very much having debates about nostalgia and memory and familiarity, I think, in a way that the reviewers of Fourth of Canada or things like that are also responding to.
Have a question?
Oh yeah, did someone else want to respond to Augusta's question?
I think it was.
I don't know anything about sound studies either. But as people were talking, all the talks reminded me of something I do know a little bit about, which is history of the book, where history of the book meets digitalization. And I'm thinking of like Jerry McGann and Johanna Drucker, and how they have done a similar thing in history of the book that you all are doing in sound studies, and that is allowing us at that point where we begin to digitalize things like pre-Raphaelite poets and other 19th century texts, allow us to rethink what exactly a text is, right? And I mean, that's a theme across at least the first two talks. And so I guess I'm just pulling this back to something that I know a little bit about, and that is this moment in history of the book. And I'm just sort of wondering, though, how is the digital humanities meets sound studies going to be different from the digital humanities meets history of the book and textualization studies? Because I do sense that there's something different, yet I'm hearing a lot of the same kinds of arguments that, you know, we heard from McGann and Drucker 10 years ago in history of the book when they were working on these kind of issues. Now, you may not be able to answer that question because you may not know history of the book, and I realize that I'm sort of pulling this back into something that I know just for my own purposes, but it does seem interesting. And one other thing, so Harry Smith, actually, the avant-garde filmmaker who collects these old sound recordings, is also obsessed with birds. And he's working with a whole new not digital medium, but a whole new analog medium, because he's putting all these old recordings on 38 rather than 78 records. And I've therefore brought together all three talks.
Well, so any preliminary thoughts about, you know, the sound of DH, you guys?
Well, I think one of the big concern, not only for my work, but when in terms of our field, is how we transmute medium. And when Jess is making the suggestion about making this material widely available to these various students in this experience, closing your eyes and imagining the wax cylinders, but we're not remotely getting that, and then that's something that we're not just aesthetically, aesthetically that's been an issue with, clearly that's a lot of the artists I'm talking about are playing with that kind of transmutation of media as an aesthetic property, but there's certainly like the practical side of it in terms of what this access means for when we're playing it through YouTube, which I've played, I use YouTube exclusively in my classes now, but which is this amazing resource, but at the same time it I mean, in terms of like capturing what the thing is, I'm not sure that we've captured the thing anymore. I don't know, maybe you can answer that. I think that's a fairly basic primary question, but.
What about, going back to your, beginning of the panel, your kind of framing question about sound and DH and the question of sampling. Just thinking about the panel we heard earlier this morning, if you guys were there, about tracing the newspaper exchanges from the 19th century. Can we think about an application like that in DH? I mean, what corpus, let's imagine a digitized corpus of sound, right? Yeah. Which one would it be? What would you want? What questions would you want to ask if you could do that for sound?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question I think about all the time. Mm-hmm. I mean, because like right now the references we have for that are like totally human and textual. Like there's great wikis devoted to like tracing if we're talking about sampling in a really literal way, there's like great wikis on like finding every sample in every song that the Beastie Boys have made, right? So you can like get Paul's Boutique and get it going and like figure out where everything comes from, right? So DH tools that could do that for us by inputting sound, I don't know. I mean, to get back to this question about the book though, I mean, this is really resonant for me because there's a guy in my cohort at Iowa whose work is on like early American epistolary history, and then my work was on sound studies. And in the beginning, it was sort of like he was a cool guy, but like never the twain shall meet or something. But he is like, actually, then Lisa's presence here.
That's Iowa for you.
Yeah, that is. Lisa's presence here like speaks to these connections, which are already very real, right? Which is that we ended up both being really interested in materiality and the materiality of text and thinking about the materiality of sound. I think are very closely similar projects. The difference is, as we're already speaking to, we don't have, I don't think, the same kind of tools yet in the sound world. And like even a spectrogram, I'm not sure what it tells us.
The big recording companies have all those tools though, of tracking little bits and finding them so that they can.
Sure, so that they can take what DCMA
Technology is
notices.
there.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Okay, my concern is what are they searching for? You know, and a lot of the music is, again, when I was, you know, the Messiaen was basing his compositions off of the way that the birds sounded on record is a really like interesting junction in terms of what these programming tools might search for. Well, I mean, what's the content then? Is it the notes? And that's a, you know, goes back to the problem of transcription. And you know, a lot of the sampling is sometimes just is the aura of a sound, and so or the timbre of the sound. And I don't, you know, so sound off, you know, is this problematic thing to try to capture in terms of, you know, I mean, the understanding of the formal content of sound in terms of transcription. I mean, this is a much longer problem and issue in music, and that is, you know, has not remotely been solved. It's actually gotten a lot, it's been spun out wider by this, you know, this digital reality.
Right, and let's get a few more people. You, and then Jane, and then Hester.
Well, I just wanted to begin by saying that in Polish, animals make different sounds than in English. So just going back to this question of transcription and how the sounds are actually already inscribed using terminology that's either linguistic or musical. But I wanted to just thank you for bringing to our attention the ways in which DH actually kind of rests on this ocular fixation. And there's so much about data visualization that really helps us think about, in my field, for example, about text by adding this geospatial dimension, but it also removes the sound. And so I think the kind of work that you are doing is really crucial to us in literary study and cultural studies when we want to rethink what the reader really is, how the text signifies. And there are some projects like the Penn Sound Archive that focus on the performance of poetry, for example, but I think there is nothing comparable done with texts that are not considered to be performed and embodied in the same way. So I think the question I have is sort of for everybody here, because we in the digital humanities are interested in sort of bringing in some kind of materiality, but oftentimes what that means is sort of that visual materiality or tactile, but not necessarily sonic, of texts and history. So how do you handle that in the classroom? And then I've heard very recently about a conference on sonification of data. And that was very interesting to me. So I don't know if anybody knows anything about it, but sort of using sonic tools to represent information. So I don't know anything about it, but this is something that just I've stumbled upon. And I wonder if there is actually a trend of using sort of something in sound studies and applying it to cultural studies or literary studies.
So quickly, a citation I can recommend, there's a guy at Penn State named Mark Ballora, B-A-L-L-O-R-A. There was a TEDx at Penn State. He's a sonification dude. And you can it's worth 15 minutes. He takes like really big data and makes synthesizes it.
Well, there's a team at McGill that coming out of the music department that won one of these digging into data multinational grants to follow melody. And I don't know what the tools are, but they'd be worth looking at.
And just, you know, which are really curious projects to me. You know, I mean, I ran an art gallery for a while. We had this artist who came, you know, established artist who was working in kind of turning digital image into digital sound, and it, you know, was so bizarre to me that, you know, this like switch in her, you know, again, but what is the base object? That we're assuming that there's this like atomic level of sound that is shared by this atomic level of like the visual that's similar to this, the bits of in the digital realm that can be equally transferred in that way. And you know, and we don't often acknowledge that these modelings are completely representational. You know, the spectrograph isn't representing the actual sound; it's some sort of representation of sound. And so then it's, well, then what are we grabbing at? We don't, it's hard to, anyways, it sounds like it's intangible. So, Jane?
Thank you all. I have a question that I think also, and Lisa, as you did, speaks back to some of the questions that came up in the previous session, but I think also brings in some of what you're asking about how we navigate these issues in the classroom. The question from the previous panel about how we read collecting practices from the 20th century back into these imaginations or database, data visualizations of 19th century reading practices, I think is one way that I wanted to ask a question and pose an opportunity to you, Jess, to talk more about how what your dreams are, your imaginations are, not only for access to this kind of sound material, but a deployment of it in a way that might preserve how collecting and collectors have been so vital to its circulation and its lack of circulation in the 20th century. That's one part of the question. And then another part of the question is not only how do you imagine generating greater access to these materials, but how, would you develop, so I loved your description of saying, at a certain point we just threw up our hands in the classroom and closed our eyes and listened, and how you imagine, for those, not myself, but others potentially in the room who have a background in thinking through, information architecture and that sort of how we actually build the thing, what kinds of pedagogical applications you would want to have for that, perhaps in relation to the other part of the question about collecting and collectors, but also more generally.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I feel like I didn't, at some point in my talk, I feel like I skipped the part where I described the core of this map I'd like to build. This is a great opportunity. And I hope I didn't, I was intending to explain my desire for another sort of tool, and I hope that speculative historical imagining does not become the dominant pedagogy in sound history classrooms. It was generative in certain ways, but mostly towards archives I'd like to be out there. What I've been thinking about for the last couple of years is actually not at all, I'm realizing now in this conversation, doesn't really take into consideration the materiality of the sounds and records I'm looking at. But I was thinking of, wouldn't it be great if there were a map, like some of those that we've seen, that would show everything from geolocated, clickable, playable, data-rich and archived sound recording. So, this song, Weave Room Blues, was recorded in Gastonia here. It was recorded in New York from these performers who traveled from Gastonia, North Carolina. So it would show that kind of thing. It would show the range and these kind of big bubbles of record stations or radio stations. It would show record stores and hopefully be linked to their logs, if any are extant. It would index all kind of things from where different performing houses and theaters and venues were, and you might be able to do something with it like enter in a particular vaudeville tour and see where they were moving. That would also link up to then maybe advertisements or playbills or any other material like that that's around. So as I'm having this discussion, I'm realizing that what I'm dreaming of is very much a predominantly like a visual, definitely geospatial sort of archive, but that would also put the sounds in there and provide a sort of central place where private collectors, the Library of Congress could hopefully put the public domain parts of these things together so that someone could ideally someday in the future say, okay, in Boston in 1945 at this particular place, what are the radio stations that the average home would have access to? What was on the shelves at the record store? And that's a huge and crazy sort of project, I realize, but I think it's one that would also open up some of these questions about circulation and about historic listening in lieu of any records or logs. I think it's a great question how to use a system like that to also trace circulations and where things end up and get stored if it's not in libraries. And I haven't thought yet and don't have tools for thinking about how to display those things visually, but I think there would be a way to do it. And I think that's definitely an important part because the fact that these things are sitting in places and staying with private collectors or going out once they've been collected over radio shows, for example. Some of these collectors have had radio shows for like 45 years, and that's the one way. And so these things get stuck in particular regions, but then maybe later they get traded around on the internet. I think that's fascinating and really important.
So like a related map of different collectors or radio stations and,
Yeah, I think-
and almost a textual network.
And that might be a great way to begin the project, actually, starting backwards. Since
Yeah.
To do something like this, it's important to go through discographies and comb out where these things actually are and where they've ended up, and to work backward from there. And I think, going to, some of these collectors that I've interviewed have told me that going to antique stores regionally was the main way they built their collections, and in certain regions you find certain collections of records that you don't find in other places, so it's fascinating.
Pastor, you have a question?
Yeah, in thinking about what a big data sound project might possibly look like, and this again may be one of the, a naive question coming out of someone who's being introduced to some of these ideas for the first time. And Craig, in your slide when you showed the bird calls mapped against the piano notes or musical instruments, I think the idea of written music appeals to many of us coming out of a background in textual studies, because it's something that we can try to translate through some kind of lexical marking or some kind of typographical marking. But obviously music is something that is often written down, but is also something that is performative, and different people recording the same song or producing a sound effect using the same notes or the same sort of constellation of things. Like I wonder if there exists the technology or the tools to differentiate between, an acoustic cover of something versus something with a full orchestra versus, or if that's just way too limited or narrow understanding of how that kind of sound technology works. There are all those the famous shorthand of writing about music is like dancing about architecture or line.
Right.
Like, how much of that is incommensurate across genres or disciplines of thought, or is that already a restriction or limitation to my own thinking about how these forms work?
No, I don't think it is a restriction. I mean, there's some people who are starting, we might all just start brainstorming some resources that we're familiar with or cool projects that we've come across. I mean, there's a project whose name I'm going to forget right now, so someone out there should Google it, where you can put in 2 songs, okay, and it uses, I think it pulls metadata maybe from Pandora to trace like sonically by steps, getting from Justin Bieber to Beethoven.
Okay.
And there are tools that can parse sounds in a way like that, where you recognize the key, the tempo, the pitch of the singer, whether it's a male or female voice. I mean, that's how Pandora's algorithms work.
Okay.
I don't know if anyone in the private sector has access to that data or how you pull that down. I mean, I think that would be one way to do it. I don't think that would be limiting. I think that would be cool.
Right.
I think that
That's how Pandora does, if you like this, you like that?
yeah.
By actually analyzing the sound?
Yeah, so it knows a song's tempo, like I said, tempo, sometimes even time. That's why you'll notice it's really easy for Pandora to get in a rut. If you like a song sung by a man or a woman, you almost get exclusively men or women after that. Because it does male vocalists, female vocalists, it pulls from that stuff. I mean, again, some of the thing that's fun here is I think we're just speculating. Even less so than Jess, there's not some magical tool that I want. I just want more tools, I guess. I just want to see where it goes, because I've listened to 1,000 bird song records, and to speak to your idea of differentiation, when you're in the analog recording, pure analog, so before electricity, you're not even making a master record. So if something sold 100,000 copies, they only recorded them 20 takes at a time sometime, right? You would record one, it could make 20 records, then you do another one. So even in one recording by a studio artist of one man or woman in the same studio would be different every 20 pressings. I don't know how much insight that would provide us necessarily in some cases. I mean, when you get into bird sounds, I think it would be cool to be able to batch spectrogram things. We would find that bird sounds are all in very high frequencies, like whistling, because in the analog recording area, when someone's literally standing in front of a horn, high frequency sounds worked better. They just did, and that's why certain voices, certain tenors were so famous. I mean, this is the era of Caruso and the high voice that could literally cut the wax as it was singing. That prefaced that preference a certain kind of sound. I mean, we know that sort of anecdotally or through technological history. I don't know if data would deepen our knowledge of some of those practices or not.
Yeah.
Did you mean echo print or echo nest?
Maybe.
Doesn't quite sound like the same thing.
There's this thing with this, it's just like an art project almost. This person did it. You can go like Madonna to whatever and place these songs. There's also a project that's
Sounds like a
cool.
dream.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's not a dream. There's also a project where someone beat analyzes songs. It's called like the Infinity Song or something. Has anyone seen that? Where a person, like, you put in like your favorite song and it beat matches that song so that it never ends. Like it gets to the chorus and goes back to the beginning in like a DJ synced kind of mixing way. Call Me Maybe is a really good one to do it with. Yeah, I mean, I want to actually go back to some of Jess's questions about how we do this stuff in the classroom and just think about some resources. Like, does the Library of Congress jukebox have an API? You know, I don't know. The LSE jukebox is super cool, and it probably has a lot of pre-1927 stuff. But there's some sound maps like the ones you're talking about that I sort of know of. There's a new one on New York noise complaints that I just saw, right? That one's cool. There's a thing called the Austin Music Map that maps like contemporary music practices in Austin and pins them to venues. Some of that geolocated stuff can be super cool.
There's gotta be something for the Mississippi Delta, right?
Yeah, and
There's gotta
there's
be a map of that somewhere. Someone's.
and there's one specific to New Orleans. There's a New Orleans music map that I've come across that I think has both historical and contemporary sounds.
There was one called Linked Jazz that was demonstrated at that camp last year.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think mapping, I think you're right, it's a visual thing, but I think it's a great tool. I mean, I think blues collecting is a great way to do it. I would love to see a cool one of like cassette tape culture in the 1980s. That would be cool.
And I think
Like,
for
they would all
more
be
contemporary
centered.
stuff, there's so much opportunity for the classrooms to actually generate these reception histories or map this sort of stuff. My students did, you know, just listening histories and oral histories with grandparents, family members, neighbors, anyone they could find. And we didn't have the time, or I didn't have the DH skills to put those things together in a map for particular places. But I think on small and local scales, there's so much opportunity to focalize a classroom and put everyone's work together to build something like that on small scales. And I think the question then would be, you know, these projects all sound fascinating, they're all over, and you know about some of them and you don't know other ones. So is there an impetus to like link those things together? Are they doing too many things and using too many metrics for that to make any sense? But it seems like there's a lot of potential for classrooms to build these metric tools.
There's this thing called apogee.org, I think, apogee.org. It's like a big world sound map. Again, a laptop person can check my data. But that might, or check that reference, but that might be something that would be cool to use in your classes, because you can record something, like your phone can geolocate a sound recording, and then you can like upload it to this map. There's some apps like that.
What's time though in history? Is it different?
Well, right, yeah,
contemporary
exactly.
soundscape work, I think, has done so much incredible mapping work with this kind of stuff, and then putting the timeline on that.
Yeah, this panel was fascinating. I think it is interesting to think about text versus listening sound, which is something cognitively completely different to do. I was wondering about that. When I walked in the room, I expected a wall of sound. And
Just a few chirps.
you guys had a couple of samples, but not that much. So I was wondering about that. And just thinking about that is how is, or if you have studied songs with harmonies and lyrics, then you have a combination of text and stuff. How does that complicate the listening? And if you have the text there, thinking about the question we had about methodology, that's the object of study itself. And then, is there a cognitive difference in approaching sound as something we engage with essentially versus text? And how does that, these are sort of naive questions, I think.
No. I think
How is that kind of study then different than what we would do in a text?
I mean, I'd like to hear what you think on, I mean, you've probably done more work maybe with music and lyrics, and in a musicological sense might have.
I was going to approach the second part.
Okay, go on.
I'll just, well, maybe we'll retrograde to that. Yeah, I mean, in terms of important differences, in terms of like of approaching the object, or and creating these resources and whatnot, is that with again, I'm so reluctant to reduce sound or music into, one text, and that, we've kind of touched on this like performativity, but then, these kind of disembodied sounds are a real, it's an interest of mine. I mean, and I don't, it's a kind of problematic of, prioritizing one instance of sound or music or recording or whatever, because, again, maybe sheet music maybe even better communicates the kind of wider possibility of performativity. So then by attaching, to take sound away from sound, thinking about the actual score of things sometimes, or just that level of things might even, going back, could open up or kind of address some of those problems of thinking about all the people behind it, or the possible people behind music, whereas, when we're only working with X, Y, and Z sound samples and recordings, as broad and wide as that is, there are weird limitations with that too.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, that's like an old Rick Altman point too, in like some sound study stuff, right? It's like you'd see a score in front of you, yet you can imagine how that score would be different in like a velvety room, a band shell, your house on a turntable. I mean, I tend to think of it in the other way, that like the score is like limiting in some way, but I like the idea that it's possible. The other thing is too, is like we don't want to get, this is also like a sound studies like danger zone or whatever. You don't want to like get too far into the realm that like sound is like this like uniquely affective, imaginative sense which like stimulates a thing that the visual does not, right? And there's some early sound studies work where you can kind of read that, and you don't want to like delve too deep into the world of like nostalgia for old radio or something. But there is something different about sounds in a certain way. I mean, I'm working on a thing right now on the history of the sonic boom, and like that's a sound that can break the windows of your house. There's some physics to it there that are kind of unique and cool, and some of that stuff is worth, I think, thinking about sound too. We're like getting into lunch.
Well, maybe one more question.
Well, I mean, I was just thinking, kind of piggybacking off that question of like, my sort of reaction when I hear sound being played in a classroom setting is to kind of like cringe, because it's not the way that I experience, like it's socially determined, and it's just how like the presence of sound is. And I was thinking about that just with regard to all these talks, like, and with electronic music, like, listening to it on your iPod, sort of walking around a city, and how that sort of transforms the ideas of value align with it. And then also like some people listen to it as background noise, like while they're doing work, and then sort of how, but is it really background, and you're sort of multitasking and things like that. So I think that like the ideas of value and the sort of the places where you're listening to them, and then like I don't listen to bird songs. I'm from Brooklyn. I don't know, like maybe I would to like learn what birds sound like, but I mean like those sort of connections, sort of affect things too. So I was wondering, and similar with sampling too, like if you have something that is using a lot of samples and you're listening to it on something that you have an internet connection to, you can start to track those samples as you're listening to it, and I think that transforms our engagement with it too a bit. I don't know if you have any thoughts on any of that.
Any further reflections? Well, maybe on that note, we should thank the panelists again for a terrific panel.